This is WFYI News Now. It's September 27th, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. On today's show, IndyGo's long-awaited Blue Line bus route is one step closer to completion. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Jennifer McCormick's plan for economic development. And 32 students at an elementary school in Avon were arrested last school year, according to a recent state report. But a WFYI investigation found those arrests never happened.
It's troubling and confusing that they are not immediately making corrections.
Those stories coming up. But first, the next installment of our regular segment called The Checkup from Side Effects Public Media, where the health reporting team explores a single question sparked by a recent news story or maybe by one of our listeners.
The U.S. does not regulate prescription drug prices like many other countries in the world. Instead, policymakers some 40 years ago came up with another idea to make prices more affordable, harnessing the power of the free market. They said, if we make it easier for companies to copy these brand name drugs and sell it at a much cheaper price, generic drug manufacturers will pour in and drive those prices down. And that's worked for a long time. It saved America literally trillions of dollars over the past few decades. But there are signs that this system may be in serious trouble. Why is that? And are policymakers doing anything about it? That's the Checkup's question for today. I'm your host, Lizzie McGreevy, and with me is Leslie Walker. She is a senior producer at the health policy news organization Trade-Offs. Trade-Offs just released a special series called Race to the Bottom, exploring the vulnerabilities in our generics supply system.
Hey, Lizzie.
Hey, Leslie. So how critical are these generic drugs for our healthcare system, and why are they in deep trouble right now?
So these medicines really are the backbone of American healthcare. I mean, they now fill 9 out of every 10 prescriptions we take. They lower our cholesterol, manage our diabetes, depression, you name it. But this essential industry is now kind of being squeezed on two sides. So on one end, you've got these often very old generic drugs, critical stuff like antibiotics or cancer treatments that economists told me have almost gotten too cheap. And so that's forcing some companies to cut corners or exit this market altogether, causing shortages and quality problems. And then on the other end, Lizzie, you've got some newer, really pricey brand name drugs that are going 10, 15, even 20 years with no generic competition at all. And so that's hurting patients too.
And I can't help but think that this is 100% bad for consumers, but it may not be all bad for big pharma. You know, those brand name drug manufacturers. Do they have a hand in any of these problems?
So they certainly do when it comes to those newer, really pricey brand name drugs I just mentioned. I mean, Big Pharma has honed some pretty ingenious strategies for stifling competition, you know, playing games with patents, paying the middlemen who buy drugs on behalf of insurers and employers to kind of favor their products over cheaper generic alternatives. And that's just to name a couple of things they're up to.
And Leslie, let's take a step back and talk about the other big issue that you highlighted, which is the shortage and the quality problems with these cheaper generics. We hear about shortages in the U.S. all the time, but especially since the pandemic. Are there signs that this is about to get worse?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Drug shortages have been kind of this perennial problem for a while now, but there are a couple signs it's getting worse. So, you know, one recent report found the number of drugs in shortage is at a kind of 10-year high, and that shortages are also lasting longer than ever before, about 3 years on average. Plus, the supply chain for these drugs is also getting more fragile. So, like I said, these very low prices are pushing a lot of companies to kind of cut corners, and that means often moving more of their manufacturing and their ingredients to countries like India and China. And economist Marta Woshinska, who's with the Brookings Institution, she told me that's raising a kind of whole new mess of quality and reliability concerns for the U.S.
Are we prepared for supply chain disruptions from natural disasters? What could happen if there's a conflict with China? We have not really truly grappled with these kinds of vulnerabilities.
Are policymakers doing anything to try to shore this vital industry up?
There actually is quite a bit of action in Washington right now. So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission is trying to crack down on some of the games that brand companies play to stifle competition. And in Congress, there's a draft bipartisan bill that targets those cheaper drugs more prone to shortages, basically tries to kind of make those shaky markets more attractive and reliable for generic manufacturers. That said, most of the moves we're seeing are pretty modest, and some experts told me they think more sweeping reforms are needed. That includes one of the original architects of the 40-year-old law known as Hatch-Waxman that gave birth to the generic industry that we have.
It was the right thing at that time. We derived a lot of public benefit from it, but we put it on this perch and made it some kind of an untouchable law. But times have changed. You have to figure out a new paradigm for new times.
Leslie, thank you so much for this valuable information. You can listen to Leslie's special series for trade-offs. It's called Race to the Bottom, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have questions that you're maybe too shy to ask your doctor, questions about health or our healthcare system, please let us know, and we'll try to get that answered on the Checkup. Until then, stay safe.
That was The Checkup by Side Effects Public Media. Side Effects is a regional health reporting collaboration of NPR member stations across the Midwest, based here at WFYI. IndyGo's long-awaited Blue Line is one step closer to completion. IndyGo recently announced the design process for the new bus rapid transit line is complete. The route will cover 24 miles, mostly along Washington Street, with service from the Indianapolis International Airport to Cumberland. Infrastructure improvements are a major part of the project and include resurfaced roadways, safety, and stormwater upgrades. The Blue Line will be IndyGo's third bus rapid transit project. The Red Line opened in 2019, and the Purple Line is set to open next month. IndyGo said it expects construction on the Blue Line to begin in early 2025. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Jennifer McCormick says Indiana needs to refocus its economic development strategy. McCormick unveiled proposals Thursday that she says prioritizes people, not just businesses. She says state government has spent too much time focused on certain regions, creating pockets of success.
We still have 92 counties that we need to pay attention to.
McCormick's proposals include more local input into economic development strategies and better support for existing Indiana businesses, notably smaller ones. She also wants to spend more on tourism and quality of place projects, like affordable housing and cultural amenities. McCormick says finding money for that involves changes at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation.
The blank checkbook and the question of spending and the lack of transparency and accountability and the question of our natural resources, there are a lot of pieces to that we need to rein in.
McCormick also says she wants to reduce the length of time that businesses receive tax breaks for locating in Indiana. And for our final story today, 32 students at an elementary school in Avon were arrested last school year, according to a recent state report. But a WFYI investigation found those arrests never happened. From WFYI's education desk, Lee Gaines has more.
The faulty arrest data was included in a report published by the Indiana Department of Education in July. Avon school officials say there were 0 arrests of elementary schoolers last school year. They say an error by a school employee led to incorrect information being included in the state's report. The IDOE is aware of the mistake, but they haven't corrected the report yet. Russ Skiba, a discipline expert with Indiana University, says the error raises concerns about the validity of other state data.
It's troubling and confusing that they are not immediately making corrections.
Skiba says the state can't appropriately provide resources and training to the schools that need it the most if the data isn't reliable. I'm Lee Gaines.
You can read the full investigation at wfyi.org/news. That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Drew Daudelin, with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. Kendall Antron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thank you for listening. We'll be back on Monday.